all of us are required to make any number of value judgments every day of our lives. Most of them happen without our conscious awareness. Nevertheless, we're making judgments. We're making decisions about what's more important and about what's less important. Consider a few examples. Will I spend some time this morning reading the scriptures to know Jesus? Or will I roll over and hit the snooze button a couple of times? There's a judgment there, isn't it? I'm not thinking like I'm making a value judgment about the way I relate to Jesus in this moment. I'm just trying to get some sleep. But there's a judgment that takes place, isn't there? Here's another one. Will I put in some extra overtime this weekend? Or will I get up on Sunday morning and take my family to the gathering of the church to worship God? There's a value judgment there too, isn't there? Here's one. Will I keep scrolling for hours? Or will I put it down, take a few minutes to bow my head, spend some time praying for my neighbors, for the nations? There's a value judgment there. And again, it's subtle, because as we scroll through the posts, we're not thinking, well, I'm neglecting Jesus right now, are we? And none of those things are just obviously sinful or bad or problematic, are they? In fact, some of them are good, right? Some of them are very good. Sleep is good. The older I get, the more I find sleep to be really, really good. It's not a bad thing. It's not a sinful thing to get rest appropriately. The question is, am I cultivating habits with good and necessary things in ways that maybe get in the way of something better? That's a hard question, isn't it? Take that career. Like, that's important. You got to work, got to provide for your family. Society wouldn't work if people don't have jobs. Like, it's good for everyone for people to work. And oftentimes people give themselves to a vocation, and God uses that in stunning ways for everybody's good. Nevertheless, it's possible for a good thing to get in the way of something better if our habits are misaligned and our desires are out of order. I'm not going to say social media is a good thing, but it's not like obviously a violation of the 10 Commandments or something, right? Again, it's this mundane thing that carries potential to get in the way of something better if it's not used well. And so every day, we run into these kinds of things, don't we? And you could probably think of more. And we find ourselves sometimes offering ourselves to something that's good. And this is what makes it really, really hard, isn't it? Like, it's easy to avoid the big bad sins, like pull out the 10 Commandments, for example, and just work your way down it. And like, we're all probably doing okay if you haven't committed murder lately. But hours of wasted time that could be used for the kingdom of God, that's a harder question, isn't it? It's a much harder question. And so Paul in Philippians 3 begins to introduce us to that tough question. Like, here's some good things in Paul's life, perhaps in the lives of the Philippians, that have potential, if they're misordered, to stand in the way of the best. And for Paul, that which is of greatest value, that which is of most important, isn't a that, it's a who. And his name is Jesus. So he's inviting the Philippians, and he's offering his own life as an example, isn't he? To begin to kind of step back and make this value judgment. Like, here's a world, and there's good things everywhere. And we're going to talk about a lot of them, he says. But sometimes good things get in the way. So if we're going to sum it up for Paul, kind of pull it all together in one central exhortation, maybe we could put it this way. In a world filled with good things, knowing Christ is the best thing. In a world filled with good things, knowing Christ is the best thing. We'll call that the bottom line for Philippians 3, 1 through 11. And we'll see how Paul begins to invite us to do some inventory. What are the good things? And are they ordered in the right way in relation to Jesus? Now, how does he make the point? How does that arise out of this text? You probably noticed that the text begins a bit counterintuitively. Here we are in Philippians at the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. We got 2 chapters left. We're only halfway through, and the first word we hear from the Apostle Paul is finally. And you're thinking, Paul, we're only halfway through. You're starting your conclusion a little early, aren't you? We get a little confused by that. Maybe some of the scholars have different hypotheses about why he does that. I think it's pretty easy. Surely you have heard a sermon where the preacher said finally way too early. You probably think this may be one of those sermons. I'm a little worried about it, honestly. But you know what it feels like. Like the preacher's preaching, and then you start getting into that conclusion, and he or she says, finally, and then they get excited about something. They remember something, that there's some application here, and we're going to assume it's the Holy Spirit, so we just keep on going. I think that's probably what happened as Paul is writing Philippians. He's going to finally, and he's ready to wrap it up, and then he remembers, oh yeah, I got to tell him about this, and then it just keeps on going. So here we are. So he's got a warning. Here's the thing that distracts Paul from wrapping up the letter. There's this thing that he's got to say that maybe he had neglected or forgotten about, but the Spirit of God in his kindness is like, don't forget this, Paul. Put this in there. Here's what it is. It's a warning, isn't it? Beware. Beware. Beware of whom, Paul? Beware of the dogs. One of the reasons I like Paul is because you always know where you stand with him. Beware of the dogs, beware of the evil workers, beware of those who mutilate the flesh. And we're thinking, you know, it'd be a lot easier if he just told us their names instead of all these like strange labels or whatever they are for these people. Like, are they Jews or are they Gentiles? Or like, who are they? Is there a sectarian name that we can use to identify them? But he doesn't do that. Assumedly, the Philippians know who they are. Beware the dogs, the evil workers, those who mutilate the flesh. Fortunately, even though Paul doesn't give us a good specific name, we can put 2 and 2 together based on the clues in the text. He goes on, in contrast to these folks you must beware of, it is we who are the circumcision, who worship in the Spirit of God, and boast in Christ Jesus and have no confidence in the flesh. And so we can begin to see, okay, Paul, I think we know what you're talking about here. You've already said they are mutilators of the flesh, and they're not the true circumcision, but we are, who belong to Jesus. We've seen this in Galatians and Romans, maybe a little bit under the surface. I think I know what you're up to. You've got a group of folks you're worried about are going to make the Philippians get circumcised. Now, chances are that hasn't been a conflict in the local church in the 21st century, but it turns out it was rather a big deal in the first century. All of Galatians is written against this problem. We don't have to go into detail there. Now we understand why Paul calls them mutilators of the flesh. Now we understand his language. He doesn't want the Philippians to succumb to legalistic adherence to the Jewish law. Is that a fair way to put it? That's what's going on, isn't it? He doesn't want them, as non-Jews, primarily Gentile citizens of Philippi, to feel pressured to be circumcised. Now, you might be thinking, why in the world would anyone feel pressured to be circumcised. I mean, it seems pretty obviously we're not doing Facebook ads like around that marketing strategy. It seems like a PR nightmare if you really think about it. Like, who's coming to church if that's what it takes? But apparently it was an issue, and here's why. Here's why I think this is. In the ancient world, particularly among the non-Jewish people, you relate to the gods with a bunch of trade-offs. Like, if you're Greek or Roman in the first century, you don't relate to your pagan gods in terms of grace. You got to curry favor. You got to do some things. This comes up from time to time in the New Testament, and it seems like it's a helpful background. So you want your crops to flourish. You want your family to flourish. You want the state to flourish. You want everybody to be well and safe and prosperous. So you offer the right sacrifices, and you go through the right rituals for whichever god and whichever temple it is for that day of the week, right? You kind of trade it off, and if you do what you're supposed to do, they'll do what they're supposed to do, you hope, and everything will be fine. And so why does Paul sort of get so intense with the Philippians, even more intense with the Galatians, if you go read that letter? Like, you can't do this. Watch out. Beware. Steer clear of these people. They're dangerous for you. Like, he's pretty energetic here, I would say. Paul is afraid that the ritual will become the priority. Right? And here's the thing, right? Circumcision is not a bad thing. Read Genesis. It's a command from God. God says, hey, Abraham, you've trusted me. You're going to be like, your family is going to be my people. I'm going to be your God. I'm giving you my covenant, which means I'm committed to you. And the sign of that covenant is circumcision. It may seem strange to us, but that's what it was. And so God commands him to give that to everyone in his house and to his children. He says, Abraham, you take the mark of the covenant and you give it to your kids on the 8th day after they're born. That, as an aside, is why we are committed to giving our children the mark of the covenant in baptism soon after they're born. That's why we do it, because God has structured his covenants in a way that includes the children of believing parents, whether it's Abraham and Isaac or us. The point is, he's warning them about not getting circumcised, even though circumcision, if you read Genesis, is a really important, valuable thing. It defines and marks the people of God. It's a commandment from God. It's good. It's a good thing. And Paul says, don't you dare. Don't do it. Why? Because your tendency as people who come out of a cultural environment where your de facto, default, typical attitude is, I'm going to curry favor with God. Like, I'm going to do something for him, he's going to do something for me. And now these folks come along and they're like, well, you want to do something, get circumcised. And they're thinking, all right, I'm going to do something for him, he's going to do something for me. But is that how you relate to the God who makes himself known in Jesus? Not even close. So Paul says, this good thing can become a dangerous thing if you try to use it to manipulate God. This good thing can become a danger to you if you try to use it to control God. If it becomes if the ritual becomes the priority instead of the devotion from your heart, then that good thing can become dangerous to you. And this is helpful for us because we have religious rituals, don't we? We've done some already this morning. We've stood together. We've recited a creed. Sometimes people come to me and say, you know, we do that every week, and it's really easy for it to get mechanical. You ever feel that way? It's really easy for it to get rote, is one of the ways they put it. It's easy to just kind of go through the motions and do the ritual and think, we just do that. It's what we do. It's what we have to do. Sometimes we get tempted to maybe change it up to help with that. Sometimes we may just not do it for a long time, certain rituals, because we're worried about doing it mindlessly. I think there's a better solution. just offer yourself to Jesus every week. Like instead of being mindlessly saying the creed, say it mindfully. Don't doze off during the prayer. Just pray. Cultivate the discipline so that the ritual, the good thing that we have to do, doesn't become something it's not supposed to be. The problem isn't frequency. The problem is our hearts. If we take a good thing and put it to the side or just sort of use it as, well, we're good Christians because we do this every week and that's what good Christians do, that's not really occupying the right place in our lives or in our shared worship, is it? There are things that are crazy important that we do all the time. In fact, I would say the most important things are things we do all the time. Eat. Take communion, for example. Sometimes we talk about we don't want to do communion more often because it would lose its specialness. Guys, I'm going to give you a little test or experiment. When you get home this afternoon, tell your wife, you're so special to me, I'd only like to see you once a month. See how that goes for you. We tell Jesus that all the time, though, don't we? We don't want you to lose your specialness, so we'll only come to your table every now and then. No, the most important things in our lives we do all the time, and we do with our best energy, don't we? Like the frequency of the ritual doesn't mean it's not important. It means it's more important. The crucial thing is not attending to it mindlessly. The crucial thing is offering ourselves in the practices so that they have their formative power. The reason we say the creed all the time, again and again and again, is so that when you're old and you have dementia and you can't remember the names of your children, in your mind you'll believe God the Father Almighty and Jesus Christ, his only Son. One time I was pastoring in a rural community in Alabama, and there was a lady who couldn't remember anything but Psalm 23. She was on hospice care and she was nearing her death, and she could not remember the names of the people she loved the most, but she laid in her bed, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Why? Not because she'd done it infrequently, because it was a ritual, and rituals stay with us. The question is the ritual in its proper place? For Abraham, it absolutely was when it comes to circumcision. For the Philippians, not so much. So Paul says, watch out, steer clear, don't do that. If you try to take a good thing and use it as a way to kind of justify yourself before God, it's a bad thing. It's not helpful for you. Stay away from it. So that's where he is with them. And then he offers several things from his own life, most of which are good things, one of which we'll talk about, most of which are good things, some of which he doesn't even have control over. And he offers them as things that are good gifts from God by and large. But if they get in the way of knowing Jesus, they're a problem. So let's read on. Verse 4, even though I too have reason for confidence in the flesh. If anyone has reason to be confident in the flesh, and he's talking about these things we do, these confidence in the flesh is these rituals we do that we might use as a reason for God to give us favor, confident before God. He says, if you got reasons, I got better reasons. You may know people like that. Circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews. Those are the things that are outside Paul's control, right? And they're all good things, right? Nobody's going to say it's bad to be from Israel. We're not anti-Semites. I hope not. We better not be. If we are, repent. But that's a good thing. Like that's his national identity. It's a part of God's covenant people from the people of Israel. He goes on. Not only am I from Israel, I was circumcised on the 8th day. That's the first one. Did Paul have any say in that? No, he was 8 days old. Is it a good thing? Yes, it's a good thing. It's a commandment that God gave Abraham and to his family. Is Paul in control of it? No, but is there potential for it to be disordered? Get to that in a second. So he's circumcised. That's a covenant sign. It's a good thing. He's a member of the people of Israel. That's his national identity. That's a good thing. He's a member of the tribe of Benjamin. Here's his tribal familial identity. Again, good thing. Good thing. And he's like, I'm a Hebrew born of Hebrews. There's this ethnicity piece there, right? And all of it's good. Like, he's not confessing egregious sins here, is he? This is his identity. It's like he can't change any of this. He can't change his ethnicity. It's a good gift from God. But if he begins to take pride in his ethnicity, we're better than you. Not everyone says it out loud, but you get the idea. If you're from here, you're better. If you're from here, they owe us something. If you're one of us, God looks on us with favor that he doesn't offer anyone else. If you're outside, too bad. Right? Good things misused in the wrong place, big problem. He goes on. Here are the things he can control. You've got all the ethnic and tribal identities. And then he goes on. As to the law, a Pharisee. So that's kind of a political sect that he's a part of, right? And he seems to be, he puts it out there as a good thing. Now that's a little weird for us because we tend to think the Pharisees are the bad guys of the New Testament. If you read the Gospels, they're always trying to get Jesus. But Paul's holding this out as like the Pharisees are the ones who love God's law and they go overboard to try to honor God's law. And he holds that out like this is his resume. It's a good thing. As the law of Pharisee, here's the one I got questions about, but he holds it out there as a gain in the past. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church. You want to know how much I care about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? If somebody is going to mess with my family's religion, I'm taking them out. That's where he is. That's his zeal. And then he says, another one that's confusing to many of us, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. I don't know if I were to say, how many of you are righteous under the law? Most of us would not want to raise our hands to that. Is Paul saying he's never sinned? Like, what's going on here? But that's not what he's saying. The law assumes we're sinners. We know that the law assumes we're sinners because it says things like, when you sin, right? When you sin like this, offer this sacrifice. When you sin like this, offer that other sacrifice. When you sin in this way, here's another sacrifice. And it goes on and on and on. The law assumes we're sinners. Is Paul saying he's never sinned? No, he's saying he's not blamable. He's not culpable because he's offered the appropriate sacrifice to atone for sin that the law calls for, right? The point he's making is that he is rigorously devoted to God's law. From where he's from, that's a good thing. He's not saying, I shouldn't have been. It's a good thing. The problem arises when you take good things and set them next to Jesus and choose the other things instead of him. And that's where this thing goes. Verse 7, whatever gains I had, these I've come to regard as loss because of Christ. I got all these gains, good things, reputable things. I'm from the right tribe. We had the first king of Israel came from our tribe. Take that. From the right people, Abraham's family, God's people. He's proud. Like, there are people who are proud of that. But Paul says, in a world full of good things, in a nation full of good things, if those things draw my heart away from Jesus, that's a problem. It's dangerous. So he says to the Philippians, he says to us, don't go there. These are things that have value. Your career has value. I hope mine does. Appropriate rhythms of work and rest and relaxation, all that has value. different kinds of entertainment, relationships. All of that has value. They're good. They're good things. But when something gets out of place and we give ourselves to that good thing instead of Jesus, we need to hear Paul's warning, where he says, in a world full of good things, Christ Church, knowing Jesus is the best. Knowing Jesus is best. Jesus offers more value than your career. Jesus offers more value than your rest. Jesus offers more value than the way you, the options you pick for entertainment. Jesus offers more. And if we saw the value, Paul wants to say, if you perceived the surpassing value that Jesus offers, that he gives us in himself, if you could comprehend that, if you could not even understand it, but just perceive it a little bit, you would offer yourself to him without reservation. You would give yourself to him fully. If you could perceive the value that he offers, it's all surpassing. It's infinite. It's more than anything else. And when we hold all the good things up there, and they're good, and we're going to do it, don't quit your job. Keep your job. Just don't let it get between you and Jesus. Just don't let it get between you and Jesus. That can happen in the church. It can happen on church staffs. Like, you can be on a church staff and your job can get between you and Jesus. So my guess is if it happens like at the Jesus place, it can happen in other vocations too. So Paul says, like, look at the value of Jesus. And you're going, all right, man, what is the value? Like, I hear you saying there's value in knowing Christ. What is it? He gives us two things. If you're into alliteration, these are your two things because they both start with R. If you got your teaching journals, write them down. Number one, there's value in knowing Jesus because he gives us righteousness. Talk more about that in a second. Number two, there's value in knowing Jesus because he gives us resurrection. That's where this thing's going. Let's read it. Verse 7, whatever gains I had, these I've come to regard as loss because of Christ. More than that, I regard everything as loss because of the surpassing value. Hear those words again. Everything a loss because of the surpassing value of knowing Jesus. What has surpassing value? Knowing Jesus. Everything else compared to that, loss, trash bin, rubbish. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things, and I regard them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ. Paul says, I will lose every good thing in my life if it means gaining Jesus. My status, my political affiliations in the party of the Pharisees, my family may cut me off because I've given myself to Jesus, but I will not compromise him. My denomination. Nothing stands in between us and Jesus because he is the one who is in himself all surpassing value. He goes on. For his sake, I've suffered the loss of all things. All things. And I'm inclined to ask, like, what have we lost for him? I'm inclined to suffer the loss of all things. For his sake, I've suffered the loss of all things, and I regard them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law. So there's the first one. But one that comes through faith in Christ. The righteousness from God based on faith. So the gift of righteousness. And then he goes on, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. There's the second one. So let's talk about the first one. When Paul talks about being given righteousness, what does that mean? It's a big deal. It comes up in some letters a lot, not a ton in Philippians, but it's here. In Romans, the word that he's using here actually comes up in the Greek text more than 70 times. We don't always catch that in our English because we use different words to render the English. But there's one word in Greek, sometimes it gets translated with righteous or right. Like the root word is right. and whatever else may come off of that. And other time, about half the time, it gets translated with the root word just, justified, justification. In Greek, it's all the same word. It shows up 70 times or more in Romans. So, like, it's a big deal for Paul. He spends a lot of time thinking about this. Comes up a lot in Galatians. Like, what's he talking about when he talks about how I get this righteousness? Here's how he understands it. Got to roll back all the way to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 25, verse 1, where you get introduced to a Hebrew law court. Anybody ever been to a Hebrew law court before? Didn't think so. Here's what it looks like. Suppose two persons have a dispute, enter into litigation. So that's the law court setting. And the judges decide between them, declaring one to be in the right and the other to be in the wrong. So that's the basic setup. It's a lot different than American courts, right? We got judges, juries, lawyers on both sides, defendants, complainants, prosecutors, bailiffs, the gallery, like we got all of it, right? Much more simpler here. Witnesses. They've got a judge. They've got a complainant. They've got a defendant, and there may be some witnesses that show up at some point, right? Much simpler process. Probably didn't take as long. So what happens? Let's say your name is Ezekiel, and you live next door to Abraham. And Abraham's cow gets in your field, wanders up by your house, and starts munching on the veggies in your garden. You've lost something, and you'd like restitution. So you go to the judge. You tell him the whole story. The other party comes up, offers their side of it. It wasn't my cow. It was Isaiah's cow. They call their witnesses. They make their case. The judge retreats. The judge deliberates. And then the judge comes out, both standing before him, points at one and says, righteous. Your case is justified. You're in the right. So Paul says that's a really helpful way to understand how God relates to us in one aspect. We're guilty. We've transgressed. We've broken his law. We deserve condemnation. We deserve his wrath. His consistent, just opposition to everything that seeks to destroy his good creation. We've wrapped our hearts around that, and he is right to oppose us. However, Paul says, Jesus, in his kindness, takes all of your rebellion on himself. And he stands in your place. And the consequences of your sin fall on him. Why? Because he loves you. And then the judge, who's also Jesus, looks at us and says, there's nothing left against you. The court finds in your favor. Righteous, just, favor. If you come to that court saying, but look at what I've done, but look at how I've served, then we're sliding back into that Roman pagan mentality. God, I'll do something for you if you find in my favor. Look at how great my family is. Look at my credentials. Look at how I've made the world better. All these things. And Jesus says, don't strive for something in your own, like your own righteousness. Just take the gift that I offer to you. And this is why his arms were stretched. This is why blood flowed down his body. This is why he died, so that he could be the judge who finds in our favor. What's the value of knowing Christ? He's the only one who can look at us and say, you're in the right, and I love you. He's the only one that it matters when he says that, and the only one who can take us in to that new life that comes with that judgment. And when he does, that sets us on a trajectory toward the second thing Paul mentions as a value of knowing Jesus. We talked about righteousness, the gift. You're in the right. When you step into that, you don't step into it, he brings you into it. When he brings you into it, he gives you hope for resurrection. Now, this is one, believe it or not, I go to churches sometimes, and there's a lot of confusion about what I'm like, what do you mean when you talk about resurrection of the body? And it's surprising to me because we literally say we believe in it every Sunday. At the end of the creed, I believe in the resurrection of the body. You're like, wait, which part are we at here? Right? We in the creed, we're like, I believe in the resurrection of the body. That's what he's talking about in Philippians 3. It's what we're talking about in the creed. It's all over the Bible. It's there. So what's happening here? Paul is articulating a doctrine, a teaching that says when Jesus comes back, and he fills this out big time in 1 Corinthians 15, if you want to read more about it, Romans 8, all over like 1 Thessalonians 4. When Jesus comes back, dead Christians are going to be raised bodily from the dead. Not like zombie apocalypse style. That's not what we're talking about here. So don't get those ideas. We think that's what the Corinthians were thinking, a lot of us. And that's why Paul had to straighten them out. Like just dead bodies, nasty all over the place. But that's not what he thinks. He's talking about in the same way that Jesus died and came out of the tomb bodily and glorified, he'll never die again. He's got those scars, but he's been healed. Same body, new life. He's glorified. He's incorruptible. He can never die again. He's defeated death. He didn't just come back from the dead. One guy I like to read says he went through he went through death and out the other side. Different kind of idea, isn't it? Jesus was raised bodily from the dead. He's still raised bodily from the dead to this very day. And that'll be the way, it'll be that way forever. And when he comes back, he's going to take that reality that's true of him and make it true of us. Whatever's true of Jesus, if he's said you're in the right and you belong to me, you're part of my covenant, whatever's true of Jesus is also true of you or will be true of you when he returns. So Paul believes, he's already said earlier in Philippians, if he dies at the hands of the Romans, he expects to be with Jesus. That's what we mean when we talk about people dying and going to heaven, all right? Paul says, if I depart, if I die, I'll be with Christ, which is far better. And I imagine being close to Jesus is far better than being in a Roman prison. Fair enough. But that's not the end of the story in Philippians. Paul's just like, I'm there, I'm safe, I'm with Jesus, it's good. And then something else happens. He's going to come back. And when he comes back, he's going to raise his people from the dead. Philippians at the end of chapter 3, Paul says he's going to take humble bodies, these dying bodies, and he's going to transform them to be like his glorious body. So whatever's true of him, glorious resurrection body, is going to be true of you. So take a look at it. No, I'm serious. Like, take a look at it. It's frail. It's breakable. It's damageable. It may have cancer or some other problem. When Jesus comes back, it will be glorified. That's what we mean when we say, I believe in the resurrection of the body. Now, let me put a little flesh on it for you. I shared, I think, a couple of weeks ago about how my dad passed away when I was 10 years old. He was 35. Cardiac arrest. The doctors told us if the paramedics had been there, it wouldn't have mattered. His brain just stopped telling his heart to beat. Nothing you can do about that. We went to the funeral. He's buried in Huntsville, Alabama. Many times, I have thought how I would love to be walking through that cemetery in Huntsville, Alabama on the day Jesus comes back. Why? So that I could be there on the day my dad is raised from the dead. I was there the day they buried him. I would love to be there the day that he's raised. Try to imagine what it would be like. Maybe you can think of one of your parents or someone else you love, who you long to see their face again in the presence of Christ. Imagine as the archangel calls and the trumpets sound The earth would shake and the sod would begin to crumble and break. I think there's probably going to be earthworms coming around because they're in there, right? They're in there. Bugs. And the ground just recedes. You know those concrete vaults that they put the casket in? Ominous, dark, cold death boxes. It's going to disintegrate when that trumpet sounds. You know those bolts on the casket when you're at a funeral and they close the lid and they boom, feel so final and it hurts so bad. They will come loose at the voice of Jesus. And as 1 Thessalonians 4 says, the dead in Christ will rise. And we will see them in the presence of Jesus, the resurrected Lord. That's why I want to be walking through that cemetery on the day Jesus comes back. To hear my dad's voice, a voice I haven't heard in over 30 years, as we together sing praises to our returning Lord. This is the all-surpassing value of knowing Jesus. The gift of his perfect love, his righteousness, all of his goodness, all of his sufficiency, all of his beauty, all of his glory, all of his perfections, all of his kindness, all of his mercy, all of his grace. In a moment, you're in the right. The penalty is gone. I love you. You're mine. And now we're on a path to the day when even the grave will retreat at the sound of my voice. Even death will be fully and finally eradicated, fully and finally and visibly defeated. This, Paul says, is the all-surpassing value of knowing Jesus. So suffering, bring it on. It pales in comparison to that, he says. If I have to die with him, I'll die with him. If I take my life to the mission field and plant churches and preach the gospel and die in a Roman prison, so be it, because Jesus is worth more. Jesus is always worth more. Always. The church will experience upheaval. The church will have to make sacrifices. The church will have to make decisions about where we're going to put energy and how we're going to conduct ourselves. Always, always, always. Only Jesus. Eyes on Jesus. Because knowing Jesus is all surpassing in its value. And there are good things all around. There are good things all around. You're going to go home and do good things. You're going to get up tomorrow, you're going to do good things. And in each moment, the question is there. Is this going to be in the right order? Compared to Jesus. Is everything in its right place compared to him? And that really just leaves us with one question, doesn't it? What would change in my life if I see Christ as having supreme value? What changes from today to tomorrow? What changes about the way I speak to people? What changes about the way I relate to my colleagues or my family? What changes about the way I choose to minister alongside other believers? Like, what changes about the way I conduct myself at my job? What changes about the tone, about the way I talk to my kids? What changes? Do I roll over and love the pillow more than him? Or do I run to the one who is of all surpassing value? What changes in my life and yours if Jesus and knowing him is the best thing? What changes?